Okay, so getting started with day two. So for today, we're just going to quickly go through and do a quick refresher of what we covered last time. And then after that, we're going to go through and start talking about some advanced CSS. So we're going to be as lovely as the designs were that we did on the last session last week. We're going to try and go through and actually make these a little bit nicer and a little bit more well designed from there. And then we'll also talk a little bit about JavaScript and just the basics of JavaScript to get started. So again, if you haven't yet, if you need to get the slides are available on the Schulke Ignite website. Just go up to the top and just go to sessions, and then it's under web dev session, and the exercise files are available on GitHub right there. So first off is a refresher. So from last time, we talked about HTML, which is essentially the structure of a page, and HTML tags and elements, which basically are an element is a composition of a start tag and an end tag, although sometimes the end tag is optional, like with images. The inner content, which can be either inner HTML or inner text, and then attributes. And then from there, we also talked about CSS, which defines how everything looks, and then how all that sort of works. So to start with, we have a quick question that we're going to do here. So if we're just going to pop open a poll, and there's going to be a couple of options, and those options will just have what will actually pop up with the CSS and the HTML that you see on screen. So whichever one's correct, just go ahead and select that in the poll. So good. Okay, I think that's all the mentees that have answered now. Oh, we had one more. Okay, perfect. So yes, looking at this, the statement that's true in this case is A, which is the world that shows up as red. So for Maud and Bonjour having no background cover, which is the one that was second. So this class dark here essentially is saying that there's going to be like a color white, and then that's just going to be for the actual text. But then the .dark class here will set the background color to black. So this will have a background color. In this case, the background color will be black. For the world being red, yeah, in this case, the world would be red because of the selector that's at the top here. So in this case, it would be A, which is right there. Okay, we're going to do one more now. So what shows up with this code? So taking a look at this, we'll have a couple options for what shows up, and then just pick the one that you think is correct. I don't know if I can see the poll. I'm not sure if it's come up yet. It's not. Okay. There we go. All right, so we got everybody's in. So yeah, basically, I think, oh, okay. So the answer in this case was A, which is that there's going to be, well, I'm going to show you here. So it's basically going to be 2 divs. Most of the page is going to have a black background. The first has the large white text that's there. Center that says hello world. And then the second div has white with the small Wonder. The big thing with this to keep in mind is that when we're looking at this, we're sort of preparing you for developers, and as you all know, developers are very bad at naming things, and so sometimes when you see the CSS classes that pop up, they're not necessarily correct, especially if you have situations like this where things are going to be overridden and they're going to show up in there. And so basically in this case, the fact that it was .dark doesn't mean it's actually dark. It means it has a white background in this case. So just be careful of that when you're looking through. Sometimes people's class names don't make a ton of sense, so just be careful. Okay, and the last thing we're going to do here is going to do an exercise. So I have the links here for all the images that you can use in an image tag. And what we're going to do is we're going to go into breakout rooms, and you're basically just going to try and build a page that looks similar to this. So you don't have to worry, if you want to try and add a border as well, you can do that if you want to try and figure that out as a bonus. But essentially what you're going to need is a header of some kind, 3 images, a list, and a link. And that's essentially just what you're looking for, and the HTML for that. So we're going to split off into breakout rooms from there, and we'll basically you're just going to try and get that sorted out. Okay, so I think we have everybody in here. So I'll just quickly walk through this. So yeah, so like I was saying, so before we need to have a header. We have 3 images, a list, a link, and then just if you want to do the extra styling, you can. So in this case, if we just come into our file, we can just go ahead. We can do the same thing we did before with HTML5 to bring all this stuff up. We need a header, so we can just do it with an H1 tag. Hello world in this case. And then it was 3 image tags. So if we do image and then we select the one with this S here, that'll give us the source and all that stuff in there. So we can just go ahead and copy this link into here. Oops. Just go ahead and do that again, but copy it properly this time. There we go. Bring that across. We'll paste that in there, and then we can put 2 more. And I'm just going to leave it all with the same image, but you can include the other 2 images if you want. And then I think there was a list and a link. So we can do just an unordered list as a shopping list, and then we can just put some list items in it like eggs or whatever. And basically this, if we go ahead now and open it up in our browser, refresh, you'll see here, we have that, we have the 3 images, and we have the list down there. All right, so now let's get into some more advanced CSS. So last time we looked at some of the basics. Now we're going to get into some of the more useful stuff and some of the more of the stuff that's actually used out in the real world. So the first fancy thing that we're going to look at is pseudo selectors. So last time when we were looking at anchor links and all that sort of stuff, whenever you change the color of just any of the text in like a div or something like that, oftentimes the anchor link won't change colors. And oftentimes you'll want to have different interactions depending on what you're actually doing based on the state of the element, essentially. So in this case, what we're looking at here, for example, is a and then :hover. In this case, what we're saying is for any anchor links that have a hover state on them. So this is basically, as you can see up here, when you hover over the link, it turns green. And so there's a ton of different types of pseudo selectors. There's also pseudo classes, which is a little bit different, but pseudo selectors are just set up like this. And it's basically to do with the state of whatever the element is that you're trying to style. Some more details can be found here. But yeah, super handy whenever you're trying to do anything for states. So like, for example, if you want to show people, when they hover over a button that it's clickable, for example, you can have them hover over it. And then when they hover over it, it gets a little bit bigger, stuff like that. So what we're going to do as an exercise is basically just, you don't have to worry about any of this stuff at the top here, but this interaction at the bottom here, just essentially create like a paragraph or a heading or whatever you want, put some text inside of it, and then have it that whenever people go over top of it, you want to have them change color and then change whatever you want as well. So make it change to a black background with some white text is ideal. So we'll go ahead and do a breakout room and let you give that a shot. Alrighty, so I have a demo here of this. So I went with just a paragraph tag that then expands and then increases the font size. And so basically what that is in here, you can see we set the paragraph tag and then just on hover, whenever somebody hovers over top of it, it'll just do, it'll change the background color, set the actual font color to white, and then it'll change the font size. Also, if you guys have seen this, this is essentially, it's what's called lorem ipsum, which is basically just some text that'll often be used in place of regular text to just sort of like show what regular text would look like. If you ever want to use some of this and have it be generated for you in Visual Studio Code, you can actually press Control, Shift, and P, which will open up this little thing where you can type in commands. And if you just type in lorem, you can pick whether you want to insert a line or a paragraph, and it'll just insert it wherever your cursor is right there. So you can see there, just gave me a sentence. So if you ever need some text, just to stuff in there to be able to test something, super easy way of doing it. Okay, now next fun topic to talk about is media queries. So essentially what media queries will let you do is it lets you just check the sort of state of the browser, and it lets you check for a bunch of different things. But one of the main important ones is that it lets you check for what size the browser currently is and what sort of screen it's on. And this is super handy. For example, if I go ahead and I open up the ShieldCodeIgnite site, I can see here when I'm taking a look at this, at the top here, we have these links. These links get really hard to press if you're on a phone, because if you imagine if we scaled this down to the size of a phone, that's probably like a quarter of a fingernail in terms of the width across the horizontal there, which makes it really hard to click. And so what'll happen is that there's in the CSS, a media query is what it's called. And as I shrink this down, you'll see it eventually become what we call a hamburger menu here. And if I click on this now it's all vertical, which there's much more vertical space than there is horizontal on phone. So that just makes it easier, and it lets you create style sheets that are more adaptive to wherever the situation is that your website's currently running on. So there's a ton of different media queries. So the first one is max width. So this basically lets you essentially have conditionals that are set up for until the browser gets to a certain width. So the best way to think about these is as conditionals, as like if statements essentially. So what this is saying with @media max width 600 is it's saying that if the browser is currently larger than 600 pixels, sorry, if the browser is currently less than 600 pixels rather, then do whatever is inside the CSS here. And so if we take a look at this, we can you can pretty much immediately see with same thing with if statements is that the order will matter a lot with this. So if we're looking here, for example, you can see we have max width and we're saying 900 pixels. So then basically, let's say, for example, we have a phone that's like 899 pixels in terms of its width. Then what will happen here is that this H1 will be 4 EM. But then let's say, for example, we have a smaller device. Typically, this 900 pixels will be desktop and larger. 768 is typically tablets. And so if you're on like an iPad, for example, then the font size would be 3 EM. And then if you have 300 pixels, which is more of like a phone sort of size, then it would be 1 EM instead. And this works exactly how you expect it. Whereas here, because again, this is like a conditional, it goes sort of down the queue. So as it's going, because this is saying less than, it'll basically skip all of these other ones at the top here, because even if you have something that's 299 pixels, for example, well, that's also smaller than 900 pixels. So it'll just skip all of these and it'll go straight to the bottom. And it'll always be 4 EM no matter what size the display is. So just keep that in mind when you're doing it, is that the order does matter when you're using these. But essentially it'll let you do things like if you want to set the width to a certain size at a certain on a certain device, then you can do that directly with media queries. Same thing exists, but the opposite, which is min width, which basically means you start doing it once it gets larger than a certain width. Same sort of idea. Order also matters, so just be careful when you're doing it. On top of that, there's some other stuff that you can use media queries for that's a bit fancier. One of them is print styles. So essentially, whenever you go to try and print off a page, you can actually have separate styling that applies whenever somebody tries to print something off. This would be super handy, for example, if you have something that's really image-based and you want to hide some of those images. So if we take a look, for example, at the UCalgary websites, when we're looking at this page here, this image is massive. If we try to print this off, it's using a whole bunch of ink that it doesn't really need to. So on the print styling, it's making it smaller, and it's also moving the content down so that it's a bit easier to read, because printing white on white is not really easy for printers. So instead, now it goes to black and makes it much easier to print properly. Screen is the opposite. So basically, if you want something to only show up if it's on the screen and not on the print, then you can do it that way. So what we're going to do now is going to do a quick exercise. So give a shot. There's some starter code available at /exercise/media queries. And what you're going to want to do with this is basically you're going to have the main div here that has the hello world stuff inside of it. Once it gets down to 500 pixels, have it take up 50% of the screen instead of taking up the full 100% width. So we'll give you guys a couple minutes to do that. Okay, looks like we're all back in here now. So taking a look at this, so I just have the demo here. So basically, as we go down, it's all taking up 100% width here with the div up until we actually hit the edge, and at which point it'll drop back down to 50% here. So the way that I did this, the only real thing that I had to add here was just this media query that just says max width, because in this case, we want something that happens when it hits 500 pixels and lower. So we only want it to happen between 0 and 500 pixels. So in this case, we want max width. And then we're just saying div, set the width to 50% instead of where it's set to 100% up here. So basically just overriding that. And then we're good to go. Okay. So next is positions. So this is basically just talking about where the browser is actually going to put an element based on like what you instructed to do. So it lays out, so there's basically this distinction between inline and block elements. You can always look these up if you ever need to, but essentially for inline elements, it'll tell you to do it left to right, and then for any block elements from top to bottom. So the first position to talk about is fixed. So basically it sets the position of an element and there's relative to the actual viewport. So it doesn't really care about like what it's inside of, it just cares about sort of where it is relative to the actual page. So if we're taking a look at this, you can see here, as we're scrolling down here, this child one right here is set to be fixed. So as it's scrolling, it's just staying where it is. Super handy for things like nav bars, for example, to keep them in place as you're scrolling down the page. Super handy. Relative is basically it sets position relative to its default position. So you add in top, left, right, and bottom and top to basically tell it to go from its default position. So if it was originally supposed to start, like in this case, you can see the parent element is right here, and then this child element is the one that has left 20 applied to it. What's happening here is that it should be 20 pixels across. So now it's moving 20 pixels to the left. And same thing here, should be 20 pixels higher than it is, and then now it's moving 20 pixels down from where it is. Absolute is basically setting it to its position to its nearest ancestor. So this is kind of this is a term that often gets used. Basically, what it means is whatever is so like if you have like the parent element right here, and then you have a div set inside here, and this this parent is set to relative, and then you have something like absolute set on the inside of the child, it'll go to the relative to whatever the div is set to, the parent element. And if you don't, then it'll go to the page instead, and it'll just position it based on the page. Lastly is sticky. And so sticky basically flips between relative and fixed depending on where people are scrolling. So as it's scrolling down here, you can see here the parent is right there, and then we go fixed for the child, and then as you're scrolling down, it's basically staying there until we go past it, and then it's gone. So what we're going to do now is going to do an exercise to try and basically create something like this. So we're going to have a fixed position to the nav bar at the top here, and then an absolute position to have the text go over the image, which is basically this like the most useful thing to have for absolute. Typically what you'll see is you'll have an image that's relative, and then the actual text is going to be absolute, and then you sort of just put the text over top of the image. You see it a lot on a bunch of different websites. And then for a bonus, try centering the image. So basically you don't have to worry about trying to get it in the center initially, but then once you actually manage to get the text to sit over top of the image, try and get it to the center and see you can get it done. So we'll give you guys a couple minutes to give that a shot. Alrighty. So what I've done here, so you can see kind of what the idea is. So you can see here the nav bar at the top here is fixed. So as I'm scrolling, it's still staying there. And as you can see here, there's actually an interesting bug that we'll talk about in a second here, where this image header, as I scroll down a little bit, you'll see it actually goes over top of this. So I'll actually talk about this in a second. But for the actual code, so what we've done here is for the image heading, which is the text. So that's this bit right here, this blue bit right there. What we've gone ahead and done is we've set that to absolute. And then we said from the top, we're moving it down 255 pixels and left 210. That's where I found it was approximately the center, although it's not quite the center. And then from there, I just added a background color to it. So essentially that one's absolute. So that's why it's shifting down now on top of the image. Now from there, the nav bar in this case, I've set it to the position fixed, and then I've just added a background color to it. And then the body I've set to min height 200. I realized that there's not enough height for you to scroll unless you add some extra height. So what I've done is I've just made the body 200% height of like your scrolling essentially, so that you can see that. I've also made one more change in here. You can see at the bottom, which we're going to talk about in the next slide. But if I actually comment this out, so if I just do that and I comment it out, or just get rid of it, essentially, if I go ahead and refresh this, you can see here it looks a little bit weird. And so with this next slide, what we'll quickly talk about is just the changes that I made there, which is this part of the bottom here, where it says box size, border box, margin 0. So the second you start dealing with more complicated layouts, it becomes very apparent that the default behavior of browsers gets really weird. And this changes across different browsers as well. And so one really good step to normalize everything is to do this. And what this does is essentially, if you remember margin from last class, which is essentially the actual distance that sits outside of elements, that's going to change based on whatever the browser says. So in this case, what we're doing is we're saying, don't allow any of the margin to be still there. Like essentially just ignore any, like don't put any margin on anything. And then what we're doing here is we're adding what's called a border boxing. So if I go ahead and refresh this now, it looks kind of more like what you'd expect. And so This border boxing thing, you can read more about it here, but what it's saying is essentially just take into account the entire way that the element works instead of just taking into account just the element without the padding. Because otherwise, if we added padding, then this would break. So just keep that in mind. And then I've also mentioned in here something called z-index. This is basically just something where the reason why it's not going whenever I'm scrolling down and it's going over top of this is because it actually has a higher z-index than this nav bar. So if I go ahead and in the nav bar, I go ahead and I go z-index and I set this to like 500, for example, and then I refresh, you can see here we're no longer seeing it. And that's because although the web is just boxes inside boxes, unfortunately, these boxes are 3D. So you have the X and the Y position, which is essentially across the horizontal axis. Sorry, the X position is across the horizontal. You have the Y across the vertical, and then you have Z, which is the height. So essentially, as long as your Z index is larger than something else, it'll be on top of it. If it's smaller, it'll go underneath it. So keep that in mind. Okay, so now we're going to talk about display types. So the first type is block, which is essentially what we have right now, but it's the default one. So essentially this is whenever you put different elements. So if you have like an H1 and then another H1, they essentially go next to each other and in a line. And that's because it essentially is considered one block of content. It's the reason why. But then if you want to stack things next to each other, you can do what's called inline. And so inline will essentially just take the elements that are inline, and instead of having them be discrete blocks, it'll just stack them one next to each other until it runs out of space horizontally. An inline block works the exact same as inline does, except for the only difference is that you can actually set padding and margins as well. So you can set like the margins that you want to put on blocks as you go. So what we're going to do with that now is we're going to have an exercise where essentially you're going to want to take this default starter code. So let me just quickly pull that open for a second here. So this is what it looks like by default. And you're going to want to take this code and try and make it look like this. So essentially you get all of these elements to line up on the left-hand side here, and then get everything lined up with these 3 columns of text at the bottom. So I'll give you guys a couple minutes to try that out. Okay, now that everybody's back. So this is what we started with here. And basically this is what we were going for. So the big thing that we can see from here is that the first thing is we want this text to line up with this image. So whenever you're doing these sort of complicated layouts, make sure to try and break your problem down into multiple pieces. So when we're taking a look at it, the first 2 things that we see right here is we want this to line up with this. So what we're going to need to do for that is inline. So in this case, we've just set the display to inline on both of these. And then now what that allows us to do is have them set to inline. And then after that, we wanted these two to go vertical. So they were originally set to inline. We just need to reset them back to block so that they would go vertical again, so that they would do the same sort of default behavior that you're used to, where everything stacks on top of each other. And then this bottom bit here, we wanted these to be in 3-column layout widths. So, and we want them to be stacked up all on one line next to each other because they originally started like this. So we're going to want to do inline to get them all stacked next to each other. And then since we want to be able to stack or to be able to change the width, we had to set an inline block on them. So if we're taking a look at this, and here we have the inline block, and then we have the width being set there. So if I go ahead and refresh this, and then, for example, if I change this back to inline, like I had before, and then do it, it'll shift them and then cause problems where they're all breaking the lines. So, okay. Now floats. So floats is the last thing that's we'll talk about as far as like the spacing goes for everything. And essentially what they're mostly used for is for left and right. So essentially if you want things to go left or right, floats are a good option for doing that. So as you can imagine, you put float and then you say which direction you want to go. Do you want to go left or do you want to go right? Super easy. So if we have something like this, where we have the float aligned to the left, then what that's going to do is it's going to basically make everything stack as if it's inline. So for example, if we have this is left line, this is left line, it's going to put both of those to the left. We have float right and float right. It's going to put them on the right. So super easy. And then if we want to get rid of the floating, because it'll keep floating everything as we go, then what we do is we use clear. So we can say clear left, clear right, or we say clear both. 9 times out of 10, you probably want to clear both and then start from fresh, but it's entirely up to you. So what we're going to do now is we're going to try and build this sort of a setup from, this is the float exercise one. So this is the starting piece, and we're going to want to try and build it into this. So we're going to want to have this image on the left, or sorry, image on the right with the text on the left, and then vice versa on the other line. So we'll give you guys a couple minutes to try that out. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So this is what we were looking for. So essentially what we ended up having to do for this was for this first image that was inside the div, we just wanted to make it float right so that it would actually show up on the right-hand side here. And then the text that was underneath it basically automatically would align to the left of that. So it's just right there. And then for the next section where we have the div with the image and the paragraph tag, what we actually did was we cleared this so that there was none of the floats from above interacting with it, and then just set the image to float left, which then meant that the text would just align right up next to it. So yeah, that's the basics for that one. So next thing. CSS has a ton of code, as you can probably imagine, just trying to get everything to fit just nicely and just right. So what do you actually do to create CSS files? Obviously, it doesn't take people years to write their CSS files. So what do you actually do? Like in the case of the Schulke Knight site, it was about 9,500 lines ballpark for the CSS that's there. I can tell you as somebody who worked on that site, I did not write 9,500 lines, neither did everybody else. So how do we actually get this done? Well, like good developers, we go out and we steal the code. So basically, one of the main things that you do is you typically will pick something like a CSS framework. And so basically what this is it's some pre-built CSS and pre-built design themes that are set up for you so that you can go and you can take that code and you can go ahead and build your website on top of that code with industry standard sort of setups that have been done for you. And it takes away a lot of the difficulty of trying to create sort of a full design system yourself. The one that we're going to be using for this course is called Bootstrap 5. Specifically Bootstrap 5, so the version number. So just keep that in mind whenever you're looking up guides, that whenever we're doing any of our slides, it's referencing Bootstrap 5. So some of the syntax might be different if you're looking at guides for older versions of it. There's a couple of other options that you guys can look into that we have down here. But we'll be using that for the course. The basic documentation is available here. And just like regular old CSS and whatever files, essentially you can either download the files yourself or you can use them directly from what's called a CDN, which is what we're going to be doing for the time being. Long story short, there's a file inside the exercises called exercises/bootstrap template. Just use that. It has everything set up for you to get started. So Bootstrap basically works on the system of what's called components. So basically everything that is inside Bootstrap is essentially all these different matters of components. So the first one is a card. And so basically a card essentially has the outer div that has a class of card, and then the inner div with some class bodies, and then there's some other customizable options. So the full documentation for it is available here. So as we're taking a look at it, this is kind of what cards look like as we're going through this. There's a ton of different types of cards, but they're essentially just ways of having nice little containers for content. So here's one type of card, for example, that has an image. This is where the card's title is, subtitle, text, all of that stuff. Then you can also include the image on the top there. So this is basically what the HTML looks like compared with the actual output from here. So you can see here, again, like I said, the outer div class card. Be careful with, this is why we oftentimes warn people against doing inline styles. I've had this bite me quite a few times. The default examples that are included in the Bootstrap documentation include an explicit call to width. So just keep that in mind whenever you're doing anything. The width is often inlined. Get rid of that whenever you're bringing in your examples. Otherwise, it'll break. So just be careful when you're doing that. You can see here the image is right there. And then these are where the different pieces sort of line up as we're going through. So the card body itself is the pink bit, where you can see all the stuff inside of it is in there. So the next component that we're going to talk about is a navbar. And so navbars are basically a way to let you have the header that goes to the top of the page. So like I showed you at the beginning, where basically as it gets smaller, it becomes that little hamburger menu. It's a nice little system for being able to let people navigate through your site really easily. And the backbone of the navbar is basically the nav, which has a class of navbar, and then you put these extra classes on top of them. As we're going through, we're going to be describing in detail sort of like how these systems work, but just keep in mind that when you're actually using them in the real world, 9 times out of 10, you can just go through the documentation, just copy the code and paste it into wherever you need to go. So don't worry about trying to memorize all this information. This is mostly here partially for reference and just partially for your own understanding as we're going through. So the next thing is the navbar brand, which is basically this bit on the far left-hand side of the navbar, which is basically just going to be like a logo that you can click to go to the homepage. And then from there is the navbar nav, which is where the actual links themselves will go into. So as you can see here, the home link starts here, and then the nav and so on. And you can see here that they're anchor tags that have the hrefs just right there. The next piece is the toggler. So that's like I was saying, as you shrink down a web page to a certain size, you'll eventually need to have this like what we call hamburger menu on the side here, which when you click it will drop everything down. That's called the toggler. The most important part of this as you're reading this, so there's a ton of this information right here that's important if you're interested in how the underlying JavaScript and everything works. But the most important thing for you is this data BS target, which is on the far right-hand side here. And the fact that this thing has the same ID. So you can see here, this is using hash navbar dash nav hash navbar nav dropdown. That's because this hash here is saying that it's an ID and it's right there. This is where a situation somebody asked me last time where ID is important. This is one of those situations where IDs are important because you need to have one thing that this is targeting. So that's what we have here. So just keep that in mind as you're going through. Next, we have buttons, which basically you either do a button element or you can do an anchor element, and then you just put a class of button on it, which will then give you something that looks a little bit like this. And the difference between these two buttons, so there's a little bit more of a distinction, but buttons for the most part are going to be used for things like JavaScript and for firing JavaScript functions when we talk about JavaScript later on, whereas anchor tags are going to be used to link people off to places that you want to send them to. That's the easiest way of doing the differentiation between the two of them. But basically both of them will have this .button class, and then from there you can add extra classes to modify the button to whatever you need, such as colors. For example, so all of the different colors in Bootstrap will all have the same names for them. So primary, secondary, success, danger, warning, info, light, dark. As you're going through, you basically just, most of the time, just tag them onto the end of something. So for example, here you have button, and then you have button dash danger, that's red. And if I want to do the blue button here, it would be button dash primary. So super simple. You'll find that as a style for most things. Same thing with nav bars. As you're looking at a nav bar, you might have like nav bar dash dark or BG dash dark or text dash white or text dash light, anything like that. Essentially, you have whatever the thing is, and then you have dash, and then you have whatever the color that you want is. And then if for buttons specifically, if you want to have an outline, you just put an outline in between the two of those. So button dash outline dash danger is basically a red button that is outlined. And you can do the same thing to change the size. So small, large, and you can also do block, which will basically make it fill up the whole width at the bottom. So it'll basically make the width 100% if you have button block as a class on there. And remember the class syntax. So this is basically saying that it's a class because of this dot at the beginning here. So yeah, so we just talked about the colors, but yeah, you can see an example of it here. If you have a card, for example, that you want to be a dark, like this dark color right here, and you want the text to be white, then it'll be BG dash dark, text dash white. Basically, it gives you a dark card with some white text. And then another piece of Bootstrap, and the main reason why we actually bother to use it, not just because it's nicely designed, is the grid. So the grid is basically a column system that we have that is made up of 12 columns. So essentially the browser is split up into 12ths. And from there, you can essentially say how big you want of that 12 each element to be. So if I had something, for example, that was, I wanted something to take up 50% of the page. Let's say, for example, I had like 2 of those cards and I want to take up 50% of the page each. I would have column -6 and column -6. Each of those takes up 6, which adds up to 12, which means it takes up the full width of the page there. So basically you take whatever the number that you're adding to the end of col dash, and then that'll basically be that divided by 12 is the percentage of the page that you're taking up. Any overflows will break lines. So if you go 13, so for example, if you have a 6-column card and a 7-column card, you'll end up with one line with a 6-column card that takes up 60% of the, or 50% of the page rather. And then you'll have another line where that second card will be shot down to, where it's taking up 7/12 of the page. So just keep that in mind. Essentially, you want to make everything stack into 12ths. And yeah, one of the most common ones that you see typically is you'll have something like a column 4, column 4, column 4, which is 3 elements. And then that'll be a common one, or 6 and 6, which will make 50% of each, so on and so forth. The other thing that's handy, as we've seen somewhere else before, is that you can change this based on the size of the device you're on. So if you have column dash small, for example, so let's say you have column dash small dash 12, what that means is it'll be 12 when the device is 576 pixels or smaller. Or let's say, for example, you wanted it to get larger when it's on tablets. Let's say, for example, you wanted it to take up a full width when it's on mobile, and then you wanted it to take up half the width when it's on tablet, so 50/50. Then what you could do is you could have col small 12, and you could have col medium dash 6. And then if you wanted it when it's on desktop to be taking up a third of the space, you'd make it col dash large dash 4, for example. So then it'll scale as the device that you're currently on scales. So here's an example of the grid. So you can see at the top here, most importantly, it starts with a row. And that's basically where you'll actually put everything inside of is inside that row. And then from there, you can see we have these divs, which are then col small 12, col large 6. So in this case, what that means is that when it's on a mobile device, it'll be a full width. When it's on a large device, it'll take up half the width of the page. So you can see this example here, where on mobile, it's taking up full width of the page. When it's on desktop, it's taking up 50% of the page. And yeah, so where this comes from, like we've seen before, this is essentially just using the, just using the max width and in this case, it'd be min width rather. So super handy. Basically, that's why we taught it to you before. So if you're ever debugging any code, this will give you an idea of where it comes from. And there's also, it's using a technology called Flexbox, which is similar to what we've taught you before with floats and all those things before, but it's a little bit different. So if you want to see some details about that, you can find details to those there. And yeah, there's also this section here that talks about details of Flexbox. So what we're going to do now is there is a starter exercise that's inside exercises/grid_exercise. So if I go ahead and pop that open, so grid_exercises right here. So you can see this is what it looks like right now. And so what we want you to do is we want you to make it so that when you get to the tablet view, which is 768, we want you to go down to, when we're in desktop view, we want you to go to a third. So if it's like this, we want you to be each of these cards to be stacked up like a third of the way. As you get down to 50%, we want it to be stacked up 50-50. And then when you get to small, we want it to be 12, essentially, from there. And on top of that, just try and make the nav bar dark as well with those colors that we saw before. So we'll give you guys a couple of minutes to try that out. Alrighty. So for this exercise, so essentially, so what I have here is, so if we take a look at it, this is basically the exercise that we had. All that I've done is just added in these columns here. So for the colors, for the nav bar, we can essentially just go through here, and instead of nav bar light, we just want nav bar dark. And instead of BG light, we want BG dark. That'll basically change our nav bar at the top here for us. And the other stuff that we wanted to change was set up these columns. So you can see here, I put them in here just to see what it would look like for this first one. So we can see here, this first one, that looks like it's working, where at the large, it's taking up a third of the space. Then if we go ahead and we shrink this down to half the size, then it goes to 50. And then from there, once we get to the full, all the way down to mobile, it'll go back up to 100. So all that we can do now is, now that works. Okay, cool. We know that that works. We can go ahead and we can put that on here, just like that. And now refresh the page. You see here, we have a 3-column layout, then half and half, and then all the way down to mobile. Alrighty. So CSS frameworks, there's a ton of positives with them, right? You have a lot less code to write. They have support for a bunch of features that you never even heard of, like accessibility in ARIA for things like screen readers and a bunch of other stuff, as well as fancy display supports. They've dealt with all the difficulty of designing elements, so typographic hierarchy, all of the color theory, all that sort of stuff, all the stuff that my art teacher told me and I wasn't paying attention to. All that sort of stuff is all dealt with for you. You don't have to worry about it too much. And then the CSS is also really optimized. All the people who are involved in this project for Bootstrap, in this case, for example, it's from Twitter. So these are also people who have a lot of sway in how browsers are developed, so they know exactly what you need to do to make it optimized. And then they'll also deal with a lot of the cross-browser support stuff that makes it really complicated to deal with. There's a reason that we told you guys to use Chromium, and it's because some stuff that exists on and works on Chrome won't work on Firefox, vice versa. So. But the problem with it is that there's a lot of code, so understanding exactly what's happening is sometimes a little bit difficult. On top of that, knowing everything that's inside of a framework becomes really hard. And then because there's a ton of them, oftentimes the skills will somewhat transition, but not necessarily, because a lot of people have different philosophies on how to do things. So it's not really like it's a standard. It's just like you know how to use it for just this one project. And you're basically completely reliant on the decisions of other people. So just keep that in mind when you're picking frameworks. Okay, now on to the fun topic of JavaScript. So when a page gets loaded, essentially the user is going to ask a server for the page, gets the page back, and then the browser goes through and loads the page. So what happens if we go through all these steps, right? And then we want something to happen here. So, it's great to have things load when people ask for the request from the server, but like what happens if, for example, we want them to play a game? We don't want them to be refreshing their page over and over again for every frame of an animation of a game. That's just ridiculous. So what can we actually do? Well, that's where JavaScript comes in. So JavaScript is basically a language that lets you run stuff in the browser. It lets you run content or run code after the page has been loaded, lets you modify the page directly so you can change the actual elements and everything that's on the page, and it lets you maintain connections to servers or start new connections to be able to get information as you need. Like, for example, Google search, being able to search through for something and get like the autocomplete and all that sort of stuff. That's all done through JavaScript. So if we're going back to our examples of HTML being the structure, CSS being the actual appearance, and then in this case, it would be the actual like dynamic behaviors would be JavaScript. So HTML being nouns, CSS being adjectives, JavaScript is going to be your verbs. So any of the things that actually have actions, it's typically going to be JavaScript. So for example, here, where we're clicking a button and it's going up by 1 every time we click the button, that's going to be our JavaScript. But the way that the actual button looks, that's going to be defined by our CSS. And the fact that there is this content here and the fact that there's this button here, that's defined by our HTML. So how do you use JavaScript? Similar to CSS, there's a couple of different options. So you can either use it as like inline by using a script tag, a JavaScript file, or you can also write it in the browser directly by using the console. So if I go ahead and open up my developer tools, which you can also do by right-clicking and hit inspect, you can see here, there is a console tab. You might have to click these little things to show it, but there's going to be a console tab. And in here, you can just start typing in JavaScript. Like, for example, console.log is the same thing as printing. So we can just type some stuff in here, and you can see it prints out for us. So yeah, if you need to test any JavaScript and you want to test it directly on your page, you can do it directly through the console as well. Syntax. End your lines with semicolons. This is actually optional, but I would recommend doing it anyways, because sometimes it can cause bugs if you don't. Curly braces are used to contain function loop bodies. This is very different than Python. So if you're used to Python, this will be a little bit different. Instead of doing indentation, you actually have curly braces, and those curly braces are what will actually wrap your functionality around it. So for example, the function, instead of being indented more, I have indented it just out of habit, but this curly brace is what defines sort of the indentation level or where things are scoped to, essentially. So just keep that in mind when you're doing stuff. And also keep in mind that the curly braces are used for more than one thing, which we'll talk about in a minute. And it's also weakly typed, which means you don't have to specify types for variables. You actually can't specify any types of variables. Essentially, variables in JavaScript can be literally anything. So keep that in mind. And yeah, as we're going through, so there's a bunch of different data types that are available. You can see here we have strings, just like that, integers, floats, arrays, and then JSON objects. This is very similar to Python dictionaries or Java hash maps or C hash maps, whichever one you come from. Essentially, there is some sort of a key, then there's a value corresponding to that key. So if I typed in JSON and then I did the square braces and then I said name, it would give me back this Kieran value here. So that would be the key to access the value. So just keep that in mind when you're doing your curly braces, that sometimes it means JSON, sometimes it means a function, sometimes it means something is inside of a conditional. Just keep that in mind. Conversions, the simplest conversions that are pretty common that come up is being able to turn strings into integers and whatnot. So the way that you can do that is you just pass the integer into, or sorry, the string into a parse int function or parse float. This will be similar in Python to just saying int of a string or int of a float. So just keep that in mind. That's the equivalent in JavaScript. There's a ton of different types of loops. So you can see here we have an array of a bunch of numbers. So this is similar to Python style for each loops, where we're saying const element of array, which basically is going to go through, and the first loop, it'll be 1, then it'll be 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, or well, in this case, it just goes up to 4, but so it would go 1, 2, 3, then 4. So similar to Python, where the actual element will be replaced by whatever the current value is here. There are C-style loops, which you're used to if you're seeing Java, or if you ever used a range in Python. So if you ever go across the range, then that's basically, so like, let's say, for example, you want to access the index, like the current index that you're at of an array, you might do this. And the reason why you do a C-style one is because you can change things. So in this case, where we say constant element of array, what we're saying here is that this element is going to be a constant value. And what it means is that as it's going through, we're just reading the value. We can't change it, because even if we change it there, it won't make any difference. Whereas this, we can go through and we can change the array at a given index to be able to modify things. And then we have just a standard while loop as well, where you can just do while and then make sure you have those brackets around whatever the condition that you want to be is in there. And then you have just whatever your statement for conditions are. The conditionals are Java style as opposed to Python style. So if you guys are used to coming from Java, from Python, it'll be a little bit different. So in JavaScript, go ahead and pop open a script tag. if we're going through and looking at something, for example, so we could say that I is greater than and equal to something. So like greater than or equal to 5, for example, in this case, that would be a valid statement. We could say that true, if we want to say true and false, or sorry, true and true, for example. So if we had something like A, and then instead of saying and like we would in Python, you'd use two ampersands, so and B. So that means A and B. So this has to be true and this has to be true for it to be the case. We could say A or B, that's going to be two lines. So we say A or B, just like that. And if we want to say equal to, you could say A equals to B, just like that. There's also going to be a, if we want to say not equal to, so A not equal to B, just like that. So we just use this little exclamation point here. Now there's another option as well for equality where we can say A triple equals to B. And like I was saying before, JavaScript doesn't really respect types. And so what the triple equal says is, let's say, for example, that let's say A, and so we'll take this. We'll just say A in this case, for example, let's say A is equal to 5 like that, and B is equal to 5. Then B is equal to 5. Then in this case, this one would be true because what will happen is that the A will be typecast to an int and then the comparison will happen. But this one would be false because this one actually respects the types of the data. So it has to be the same value and the same type, whereas double equals means the same, just the same value. And the same thing is true for not equal to. So if we did it this way and we said A not equal to B, in this case, this would be false. And in this case, this would be true. So just keep that in mind when you're doing your conditions. And then additionally, there's also functions. They function the exact same way as you expect in any other language. You essentially just say function. This is similar to saying def in Python. You put whatever the name of the function is. So let's say myfunc, like that. And then you put, if you have any arguments, you put them in here. So let's say, for example, if we were, sorry, yes, in this example right here, we'd have that one, like that. So not, it would be not equals to, and then not double equals to B for that example. And then for this one, if we had just a plain function that didn't do anything, it would just be like that. And then if we want to include some arguments, let's say we have A and then B, and then we wanted to add them together, we could also then return A plus B. Same way we would in most of the languages that you should be used to. Or we can just return nothing and just do stuff inside there. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to do this exercise, and it looks like we're running a little bit long. So what we might do is we might end up cutting some of the content that's just the end of this and slowing down the pace a little bit. And then we'll do some of the rest of the stuff in the next session as well. So for this session, we're just going to go through, and what you're going to want to do here is you're going to want to use the console to start with a string variable, convert it to an integer in the console, and then run through and make it go from 0 to 10. So essentially just loop through it, make it go from 0 to 10 after you've converted it from a string to an integer. So we'll give you guys a couple minutes to try that out. Okay, so taking a look at this exercise. So essentially what we're doing is we're starting with a string, and then we want to convert it to an integer, and then we're going from 0 to 10. So I'm just going to use the same page that we were using for the last example in the navbar. And what we can do with this is inside here, we're just going to go ahead and we'll just say x, and we'll just say that it's equal to 0 in this case. And then what we can do to convert it into an integer, like we saw on the previous slides, is we can do x equal to parse int, and then we can just say parse int of x. So we're essentially resetting x to itself, but changed into an integer. And then from here, what we can do is we can say while x is less than 10, we're just going to go through, and there are a couple of there's a couple of ways that you can do this. You can either say x plus equals to 1, or in JavaScript, you can also do x plus plus. Either one of those is fine. Out of habit, because I write Python, I'm just going to do x plus equals to 1. And then in this case, if we actually go ahead and run this, it'll it'll just print 10 in this case. If we want to see what each of them is, then what we can do is we can say x is equal to 0. Again, we can say x is equal to parse int of x. And then while x is less than 10, what we want to do is we want to say Yeah, x plus equals to 1, and then we want to console.log it like that. And then now we'll actually get all those things. So console.log is essentially the same thing as print that you've seen in other languages. Essentially, this section here, like I said before, is called the console. So we're essentially just logging this value to the console as we go. You don't have to make it a string first. The only reason that we did that in there is just that you get experience doing the conversions. You can just, if you really want to, you can just say, x is equal to 0, and then do the same thing and just say, while x is less than 10, and then do the same thing. Yeah, true. If you make it an int first, then decide to replace the 100 yen. Okay, so this is the last part that we're going to cover, and then next week we're going to go through and we're going to just do the JavaScript section as well, the rest of the stuff from there. And then also next week we're going to do we're going to actually go through and have you guys build out a site yourself. So, but for right now we're just going to finish this last topic, and then we'll save the rest of the slides for next week. And yeah, so one of the main reasons, like pretty much the only reason anybody ever actually uses JavaScript, is because you can modify the page when you're using JavaScript. So there's actually 2 different available objects that let you get and modify content in the browser. There's the document object, which lets you work with the elements in the browser. So that's everything that you have inside your page. And then there's the window object, which lets you work with the browser itself. So it lets you see the screen size, all that sort of stuff, all the URL, all that essentially. So you can think about the breakdown kind of like this. So essentially this top part where you see everything, all of like the tabs and everything at the top here, the URL, all this stuff, this top piece right here, that's going to be the browser and the actual like outer window itself. And then the actual inside here where we see all the content of the page, that's going to be the document. So one handy thing is, like I said, getting the URL. So if you want to get the URL of a page, we would use the window because that's part of the browser. And then from there, we're going to use the dot location. And location is an object that basically just has a ton of other attributes that lets you get information about the page. The one that we care about is href. So window.location will give you a ton of information, more information than you'll ever need. And then window.location.href will give you the current URL. And just like any other object, if we change its state, if we say window.location.href is equal to something else, then that'll change the value on the page. And that's basically a way of essentially forcing people to go to the page if you need to. So if you need to send somebody to Google from whatever page you're currently on, you can just reset their window.location.href, and that will send them to a new spot essentially. And so that's basically the same pattern with everything, is that you'll see that everything in the browser is an object, and changing its values is essentially how you update its state from there. So on top of that, there's some other stuff that's super useful that you can get from the window object, such as the screen size. So there's 2 different types of screen size. There's the inner width and the outer width. The outer width typically won't be used at all. I don't know how old everybody else is in here, but if you've ever like used somebody else's computer who's like older and they've installed like a million toolbars, then the height of the browser will include those extra toolbars that are on top of it. So whenever they have, like fast cache toolbar that's installed and it like takes up the entire row on the bottom there, that value of the height will be included on top of the actual window height. So it's generally speaking a pretty useless measurement for the most part. So people tend to just use the inner height instead, which is just the content of the document essentially. So whenever you're doing things, if you need to do them in JavaScript, I typically recommend using the inner height and inner width as well. This is just some information about storage stuff. You don't have to worry about this, but if you ever do find yourself needing to use storage, that you need to store things for people long term, you can reference back to this slide and find the information there. Basically, there's just a couple different storage options you have built into the browser. So the main thing that we care about for this is document manipulation. So being able to change things on the fly. That's basically the main thing that's important about JavaScript, is being able to go into a page and then change the elements or change the document to be able to do things. So we're going to quickly talk about how to change elements inside the document as we go. So the first thing that we have to do is we have to find the element. So they essentially all have the same steps. We have to find the element, and then we have to do whatever we want with the element from there. Creation is the only thing that's the exception to this. We'll talk about that later on. But essentially finding the element and then being able to delete, update it, whatever we need to do, is the steps that we're going to follow. So there's 2 different ways of finding, well, there's 2 different classes of ways of finding things. So the first is document.getElementsBy, and there's a couple different options there. So there's class name, tag name, or name. Don't worry about the last one. That's mostly for forms. But class name and tag name. So class name is essentially, it will return an array of element objects that have the same class that you've put in there. So like, for example, when we were looking at cards before, if we want to get all of the cards that are on the page, we would do document.get elements by class name, and then we put card in there, and it would give us an array of all the cards. And if we want to do it by tag name, if we want to find every div on the page, we could do it that way. And then you just access the index of the array to figure out what you want to do. The other option is get element by ID. Like I said before in the last session, there's a reason that IDs are important, and it's for finding things where you only want one of them to be available. It just simplifies your JavaScript and makes it much easier to use. Changing data is basically just a matter of, well, changing the data. So if you wanted to get the data itself, so if you wanted to get the tag name, for example, you could do .tag name. This is the only one that can't be changed directly, so keep that in mind. You can't change this. But if you want to change the inner text, which is the text inside of an element, this is super handy for headings and paragraph tags. And if you want to change the inner HTML, that's just called .inner HTML down here. So the inner text of this right here, where you can see we have an anchor and the text across here would be hello world. And then the inner HTML of this h1 tag would be the full thing with the anchor tag inside of it. So this is the last exercise of the day. This is the last thing that we're going to be doing. Next week, what we're going to do, I'll just show you the heads up for next week. So next week, we're going to finish off JavaScript, and then we're also going to have you guys go through and try covering building these sites. So starting from actual full templates of all the HTML as well included for you, and then going from there to modify those to build out sites really quickly. So we're going to talk about that next week. We covered a ton of stuff today. I apologize if it was a little bit quick. We'll try and slow down the pace a little bit, especially for the next session. But what we're going to do for the time being is there's some starter code available inside exercises/button._text starter, which is right here like this. And all you're going to want to do with it is basically find the inner HTML of the main content div. So if I go ahead and pop this open really quickly, so basically find the inner HTML of this div right here, then try finding the inner text of it as well. And then basically just try finding the URL of the page, and try finding the inner and outer heights of the width of the browser when you're on ShoeLookIgnite.com. So we'll give you guys the last little bit here to try that out, and then that'll be it for today. Okay, so we're just going to quickly cover the solution to this, but you don't have to feel like you have to stick around. I know we went a little bit over time. So yeah, next week we're going to try and slow down a little bit and go a little bit slower through some of the content, and make sure you guys have a lot more time to work on stuff. But for right now, we'll just talk about how to do this one. So first off, we're trying to find the inner text and then the inner HTML of the content. So in this case, you can just open this up in the console. And in this case, what we can do is we can do document.get element, and then in this case there is no ID, so we just have to do by, it would be actually elements by class or by tag name. And in this case we want to get the div, and we would want the 0th element of that div, so that'll be the very first object in the div. And you can see it automatically highlights for us whenever we do the selection, so we know where it is. And then from there we can just do the dot inner text. That'll give us all the text, which is in here. And then if we do .inner HTML, we can get all the HTML. And then if we ever needed to change any of the text or the HTML, what we would do is we would, I would always recommend changing the inner HTML. It's very rarely worth it to change the text, because otherwise it'll cause problems a lot of times. So just stick with modifying the inner HTML if you need to change any of the content inside here. And then the other one was going to ShoeLookIgnite.com and just trying to find the location. So in this case, it'd be window.location.href, which would show ShoeLookIgnite.com as a string right there. And then if we do the same thing, we says equals https://google.ca, that would basically send us off to google.ca, just like that. So again, apologies that went a little bit quickly. We're going to go through and recover a lot of the JavaScript stuff next week as well. And then what we'll do next week is, like I was saying, we're going to start working with some actual HTML templates to start building out actual websites. So next week, you'll actually be building a real website for yourself. So thank you for coming, and we'll see you next week.